Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Maja House and our Saturday online session. Today, we have Suchitra Vijayan's extremely important, extremely significant, beautifully written book, Midnight's Borders. She calls it a people's history of modern India because the focus is firmly on ordinary people and communities who live on these borders. Let me show you the book. It's Here it is, and I think you should order it. Get it on Amazon and get reading. It's really worth it. Um, Suchitra has traveled some 9,000 miles over 7 years, and she brings to us through this book heartbreaking stories. And she tries to understand India through her borders and her people, her border people, the many borders that India has with all our neighbors, China, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan. She has traveled to each of them and brought us all these, like I said, heartbreaking stories. I really can't find words that are that I can describe this with. Through her storytelling, her reportage, her beautiful black and white, very stark photographs, I felt like I was also on the road with her, listening and understanding the many, many forgotten histories that are being played out every day. Mostly they are unseen and unheard. These are stories from Kashmir, from Punjab, Rajasthan, Bengal, Assam, Arunachal, Mizoram, Nagaland. And they're about migrants and displaced people. They're about loss of identity, loss of dignity. It's about abuse in very highly militarized zones. And these stories are going to stay with you for a long time, as they stay with me. We were talking just now when I was telling Suchitra how so many of the stories seem to haunt me. And faced as we are today with the crises of every sort, political, economic, medical, agriculture, this discussion between Suchitra and Annie Zedi is, I feel, an especially important one. Suchitra is a barrister by training, and she's worked previously for the UN War Crimes Tribunal in Yugoslavia and Rwanda before co-founding the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo, which provides legal aid to Iraqi refugees. She's an award-winning photographer and founder and executive director of the Police Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization, and she lives in New York. In conversation with her, we have Annie Zedi, award-winning author, playwright, poet. She's the author of Gulab, Love Stories 1 to 14, and Noon Turf, Bantering with Bandits and Other True Tales. She's the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing, and the author of Prelude to a Riot, her brilliant novel about today's India, which paints an incisive portrait of the divided times we live in. In many ways, I think that between Annie's novel and the book that Suchitra has written and the one that we are going to be talking about today, there are lots of points at which they seem to talk about the same thing, coalesce in not just about riots or anything, but definitely about the insider and the outsider and what makes you an outsider and why. So I'm going to hand over to Annie now. And before that, say thank you to both of you for coming on board and for being at Maja House today. I hope we will be able to do this later at another time in a physical avatar. Thank you. Annie, over to you.
Thank you, Preeti. Gosh, okay. I'm not very sure if my voice is stable.
Yeah, you're absolutely clear and loud and clear.
All right, okay. Thank you for the introduction. This is a gorgeous book. I'm quite happy to unreservedly recommend it. And one of the things, I mean, the fact that it's an important book, to me as a writer, is secondary. It's an important book, yes. The research is great, but it's also just a really well-written book. And that really, I think, matters to me. I'm going to pick up on this one sentence and I'm going to dive into the most difficult question first, Suchitra, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
I'm quoting here from nearer the end of the book and starting with Punjab, although you've covered so many borders and I've learned so much more from uh, your book about the other parts of the country as well. The conversation tends to be hijacked by Punjab a little bit because all our memories, our visuals are so much about the partition that happened in 1947. But there's something I picked up on from that section. One is, of course, that really gorgeous story about the war and the tractors. And maybe you'll tell the audience, those who are gathered here, about that story. I'll let you tell that story. I just want to quote this sentence. At the end, you say something India is not yet a nation. She's a puzzle rearranging herself. That is something I want you to comment on, how you came to that. And the other thing that I'd like you to talk about, you interview this man, Suj, and you talk about how his memory is very sharp. He remembers, and a lot the difference between the rhetoric of those who are older and who actually have suffered partition and who have suffered a certain trauma to the generation now that is almost 3 generations down the line that actually has suffered no trauma at all. Their lives are okay, they may or may not have inherited some trauma, but by and large, they don't have cause for as much antipathy as they actually have towards the other, whatever could be Pakistan, could be Bangladesh on either side. Could you talk a little bit about that? The location of trauma and the capacity of the older generation to be honest and to forgive a certain time.
Annie, thank you so much. I want to start by thanking you for this conversation for 2 reasons. One, because you're a writer that I've followed for so long, whose work I respect, loved, but more importantly, always wanted to emulate. So to having you here in conversation is it's absolutely overwhelming for me. So thank you. So in terms of the first question, India as a puzzle rearranging herself, what I really found as I traveled is that the rhetoric that we are fed with, that we grow up with, at least I grew up in a household in which my father was very much, a strong believer in Nehru's ideas of India. You're often told that India is one. You're often told that there's a certain value for freedom. But also those ideas of privilege, of thinking about secularism, thinking about ideas of a secular republic, is also means that you've lived a very specific privileged life. For many in this country, India perhaps is not secular, perhaps is not democratic, but more importantly, might not be a republic where law treats everybody equally. Along with this, I also realized that history and memory is so local, which means that people, even when they start, have a very different sense of belonging. Their maps of belonging are different. Their emotional maps of identifying with something is different. But more importantly, all of these communities that I spoke to made their own maps. When you speak to Mr. Suj, there's also a map in the book where one of the things, objects that he travels with during the partition is a textbook, old Hindi geography textbook. And first when the partition happens, he kind of draws the first pencil line on it. And then once, East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh, he draws another line. But in his head or in his mind, his racial memory, all of this is one. In his racial memory, the map of belonging is to his little village where people spoke Sindhi. Punjabi, as the Punjabi culture was not just Punjabi culture that we have now been handed over by the popular culture in India, but rather the culture which is very different, where language belonged to everybody. And I think people are still trying to make sense of that. And second part of it is that for someone like me who grew up in the south of India and Madras, the partition has a very different, it's a very different way of nation making. The way that my communities were brought into the Indian Republic is still very different. And one thing you constantly find is also a sense of resentment in terms of where people believe that their ideas, their culture, their memory of what it means to belong to a nation are all being constantly taken away from them. So that for me is India again. It's what Jinnah says, right? That India is a subcontinent of nationalities. So many people from so many different histories, ideas of migration, memories, put together by an act of violence, but also an act that was essential for what we thought was freedom. So that was where the rearranging idea came from. Now, thinking about trauma, I think there is no one way that trauma then gets translated. In the beginning of the book, you encounter people whose idea of a nation is not India as we see it. These are people who were born before India became a nation, and then they see history kind of handed out to them. And towards the end, there's this chapter where a dear friend says that once you take a bag and you move, it doesn't matter. You can never unpack that suitcase. It always feels like a metaphorical suitcase that is in your house. Even though her nieces never faced the act of migration, they have somehow passed on trauma. In the case of Natasha in the last chapter, what is a trauma? She didn't even know that her great-great-grandfather had died in Jallianwala Bagh, but that act of violence, trauma, then transmutates itself and then passes on. And another interesting aspect is what stories of people were told in a way that became part of national history, and what stories that were not told, which were again not passed on. I think acts of violence are passed on, but somehow acts of happiness perhaps have not passed on. For example, Mr. Suju's great grandkids and grandkids had never heard of the story. Even discovering him, and that was, so I think trauma varies. And I don't think we can understand how the trauma works, because there's both personal and political that kind of plays out throughout these stories.
Would you like to tell the audience here the story of the tractors here? It's a delightful story, and obviously they take great pride in it also.
I feel it's I don't know. I think the story has to be read, but the larger point is these are communities that live in the border. And the story is, when I first land in a place like, especially in these bordered areas, myth and Bollywood and personal stories all come together. So first, when I'm in this border areas, I re-encounter the story of how we had a group of these soldiers fight, the Indian soldiers fight and occupy a sand dune. And then the story gets retold in different ways, and how people came together and fought. I really wasn't sure if the story was true. One of the stories was how the local community got together and then went to the border and fought them off. Another version of the story was this great battle in which we lost so many soldiers to carry a sand dune. So when I first encountered the story, I don't believe that the story happened. But then the family that I was staying with, one of those days after finishing the field work, the person who's driving me around, the family that I'm living with, then discovers, is dropping off women, and then discovers the gentleman who was actually part of a tractor brigade that goes on to fight the army, the invading Pakistani army. And they do it by removing the silencers off the tractor and driving in a formation towards. And in that way, the story is that they've driven away or held the Pakistani army back till the Indian army reinforcements arrive. And it was a story, again, as I said, I think I've glossed over this in a very fast way, but I think the way the story encounters is how communities came together. And but again, also the part of it is that these stories then get lost because these stories have not been told. These acts of individual resistance then get taken away and remade into a nationalistic story. But yeah, I think I would definitely recommend people to go to the chapter. But more importantly, from the tractor brigade that goes to fight off the Pakistani army coming in, it's the other stories, the memory of the home that they left behind, remembering every single railway station that this person would stop in before he got home, and about thinking about language and food. So I think every person's life has these multiple layers. And I think for me, the story was also about what parts of these stories get gold and what of it gets lost.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't hear clearly.
Yeah, you're audible, Annie.
Okay, all right, thank you. Um, if if I'm getting a message here saying that my bandwidth is low, so if at any point I'm not audible, please send me a message.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Uh, one of the things I really like about this book is that it is in some way an act of recovery. Not only the recovery of individual people's memories, but also a sense of recovery of the idea of what the border means. Because everybody seems to be, especially those of us who do not live in border areas, we have a conventional and and a nationalistic, to a large extent, a nationalistic government defined, popular culture defined idea of what the border means. We see it merely as a place to defend. We don't see it as a place to live. And this is something which the book really brings out with great pathos and with searing honesty in multiple parts. You know, there's the China border, there's the Bangladeshi border, different parts of the country. One of the things there is that the Nagaland chapter, for example, um, there is so much with great mixed feelings. I read it not only because of the descriptions and the memory that still remains of the trauma, and not just the trauma of, say, partition, but the trauma of the war, the Second World War. Tell listeners here a little bit about that part of it, because we tend to forget that things can happen to countries which are beyond either internal disputes or border disputes, but still affect people who live in the border periphery areas more than they affect people on the mainland.
Um, Absolutely. The thing with Nagaland is that I wrote this book from, I know there are people who write a book from a place of absolute knowledge. And then there are people who write books to understand what's happening. I'm not a South Asianist by training. So for me, when I went to these spaces, I went there trying to make sense of this place. And for me, what was not surprising, but it's this moment where you know something, but you don't know it really well. And one of the things you realize is that, especially places like Nagaland, um, we think of it as a specific border region, but the border region happened now. There's a much longer history. There's a much longer history of violence. In terms of geography, how we look at these spaces also, and I feel in some ways restricts our understanding of this space. And we forget that the empire just existed only a few years ago, right? 1947, if we think of it as the birth of the nation, it was not a very long time ago historically. And long before the nation states proliferate this region, there was a war that had a deep impact on these spaces, and that is the Second World War. And this region, and also what you really see is that these are not nationalistic stories, right? These are not stories about a nation. These are stories about transnational memories, transnational wars. And the chapter in Nagaland, for me, what was once interesting is that the violence of the empire is very similar, whether it is the British occupation of the region, whether it is the Japanese trying to come in, whether it is the process through which these regions were then put together as a part of the Indian Union, how India, a nation state that was born out of a certain act of revolutionary freedom or demand for a certain kind of revolutionary freedom, then gets co-opted into a nationalistic framework. And then the violence of the empire, then it's not just the departing forces, because then India, the nation state, kind of starts taking on the role, or at least mimicking some of these behaviors. And also you understand the global nature of it. You'll encounter someone, you'll encounter, if for example the war memo, the cemetery, the walk, encountering someone whose ancestors had lived in who had fought and died in the Second World War. But also that is linked to stories of other colonial migrations. Miss Keen says that there's some kind of an Indian heritage in her. She's come to search for her ancestors, but also paying tribute to her father who fought in this war. But then very quickly, also you see how Islamophobia very quickly plays out, where she says that, you know, there's a Muslim problem in Britain, and then how she's joined the UKIP party because the Britishness is being invaded. And Mr. N very quickly says, you know, you're in a symmetry where, you know, men of so many different races fought and died for an empire, and you're talking about it. And then very quickly, you also encounter Andrew Jackson, who's an African-American soldier who's come to kind of reclaim his own family's history, where African-American soldiers built the Lido Road. That story and history is never taught to us. It still seems like I was, or the jazz musician, Alberta Hunter, then kind of traveling and, you know, entertaining the African-American troops. And then now coming to a physical space that might hold an history of your ancestor, but that entire region, the physical spatiality of the space being taken away. And of course, you don't talk about the Japanese who lost so many men. And you realize how many different communities in this one war memorial. So this is a transnational history of war, migration, movement. And then there is a connection to it, right? Those who saw those who survived the Second World War see the first of the Indian Army tanks moving in. There's this one line in the book where Mr. N says, you know, I remember, I'm beginning to forget, but I remember, you know, one thing I do remember is how a body falls on the ground when it's hit. So it very quickly becomes that these are spaces that hold so much history that it's not a national history. There's a transatlantic history. Already you have, you know, an African-American soldier coming in search, who also then goes on to serve in Iraq and talks about how. So the ways the empire works is also, you know, it's so complicated, and it kind of intersects with each other. And also for me, discovering what it means to be within what is still a part of India's territorial sovereign region, but the people in those spaces having very complicated, often painful, violent memories of what it means to be brought into this nation state. And these are not black and white stories. And I don't want to use the word nuance, because nuance cannot work when you talk about acts of violence. But there is a very complicated history. There's a lot of threads that one has to tease out. And people's complicated relationship with what it means to think about justice, what it means to think about freedom. And these are not things that one can really reconcile with easily. So that's how and also it was very difficult to put these chapters together, because it's something like a story like this could meander and become so large. Then how do you then bring all of them together? There has to be a thread. And that thread, of course, is how people think and remake and keep making their own maps of belonging.
So,
One of the things that strikes me about this book, the different sections, the different travels that you've undertaken, whether, even though the most striking part of the book is the characters, the people, and the stories you tell about individual lives, and use those lives as a prism to reflect uh, on the state, on infrastructure, various things, violence nevertheless remains a threat. There's no escaping it. I mean, whether it's the East or whether it's the West, I mean, on the West, there is this constant threat of war that we have had wars, and that is a narrative that isn't allowed to also really die down. You know, it's just politically, the two countries feed off hostilities with each other. But even otherwise, I mean, aside from that too, Bangladesh, we haven't had wars with Bangladesh, for example. We do have friendly relations. And yet in Assam, elsewhere, there is such violence. And do you have any thoughts about this, about is it possible to live in a border area and not confront violence? Is that even a possibility?
The honest answer is no, it's impossible to live and not confront violence. But it's also one thing that, again, you realize in the book is that it's not just the border anymore. There are vast majorities of people in South Asia, and I say South Asia because I think you can't just think of these within the nationalistic frameworks, especially given that so many of us come from so many histories of migration and belonging. And the violence is not just the physical violence of, a person being killed, attacked, riots and pogroms, small massacres, big ones, little pogroms, larger ones, some documented, undocumented. There are also different other kinds of violence. There's the bureaucratic violence. There is a violence of denial of personhood. There is this everyday negotiation that one has to keep performing in order to just live with a certain kind of dignity. If you look at the Bangladesh chapter, there is this moment when you're trying to understand the history of, or at least the rhetoric of illegal migration, right? You're all automatically saying that these people are illegal, these bodies are illegal. And then you say these illegal bodies then commit crimes. And then you say that there is smuggling. But the moment you kind of go in and figure out what is it that they're smuggling, right? They're smuggling chilies. They're spilling the cough syrup. They're smuggling saris. They're smuggling, contraceptives. And the point is that, or fake Nike shoes. And what is the profit margin on all of this, right? It's people are risking their entire livelihoods and dignity every single day in order to get by, right? And this is not about looking at the powerless or those without access to power or those farthest away from power completely as victims, because that then deprives them of a certain agency. The violence that many in India live with, encounter, is the violence of simply existing in a nation state, where if you don't belong to certain categories of privilege, certain categories of power, then your everyday is just it's brutish nightmare. And in some cases, that violence, a single act of violence doesn't stop with that. That violence then becomes systemic. An act of, say, a lynching then is not just an act of losing a single person. Often it's an act of an entire family's income becoming, impossible. In some cases, an single act of lynching can drive away an entire community out of its village because they are fearing a certain kind of it. So imagine a community already facing violence, then now dispossessed of land. That access to land means some kind of livelihood that's completely destroyed. Now imagine trying to build up these things, and in this process you have processes like the NRC, CAA, other processes that are being played out, the Aadhaar card, digitalization of our IDs. All of this also feeds into a certain kind of bureaucratic violence. And yes, the violence that one encounters in the border is very particular. But it's not just the borders. There are trenches and borders being created in the body politic of the nation itself. So yes, it's impossible to not encounter this violence, but I think it's also important for us to recognize that this violence comes in multiple forms. And sometimes it's difficult for us to understand how these various violences then coexist and keep building a system that oppresses large communities.
One of the things about India is that its borders, we share a lot of borders with people whom our identity is very different. Unlike, say, the United States and Canada, where it's two big countries, but both in racial terms and in structures of power, it's more or less same religion, same color, more or less. India, by and large, one of our problems is that our big border disputes and big border confrontations also translate into linguistic and religious disputes, because the otherization that happens. So for a minute, let's forget the others. Tell me about Nepal. We don't have a religious dispute in that sense, in majoritarian terms, with Nepal. So how was that experience?
Right.
Does that change the border experience?
Right. So kind of a bit of a prologue to that is that Nepal doesn't appear in the book. And the way we were having this conversation before is that a lot of the stories didn't make the book. So you will not find Nepal in this book. And there's a reason why a lot of the stories didn't make the book. Soon after Article 370, and very quickly followed by a series of other actions, including the CAA NRC that happened, a lot of the people that I've spoke to no longer wanted to be a part of this book. Even parts of the book really had to be rewritten because things were changing. So around September, November of 2019, when I thought I was close to finishing this manuscript, the book just fell apart. Because the Kashmir work was done in 2015, 16. There were other works that had to be rethought. People didn't want to be part of that. So you will find that Gujarat doesn't appear in this book for very similar reasons. While NRC appears, not all of those stories appear. Similarly with Nepal. So in that sense, I also wrote this book as an act of collaboration, in the sense that I would send entire transcripts back to people. I would, make sure that everything that was in the book was something that people felt comfortable with. Because sometimes when you speak, and when you come back in retrospect, this might not be the way in which one would want to be portrayed. And I think the dignity of the people in the book was very important to me. When I said this to a journalist friend, he said, you can't do that. You should never do something like this, because, you can't make people an active. I said, but this is not so much a journalistic work. It's a very different kind of work. So a lot of the stories, so this book you see in this is a book is also a function of our time. It was edited more by the current events, the acts of legal bureaucratic violence, just as much as my wonderful editors who helped me put this book together. Nepal is different in that it's one of our most easier borders. It's an open border. It's a border that has often been easy to navigate than other borders. But these borders also have other kinds of violence, because, for example, next to the Nepal border is also sites of one of India's, greatest, rebellions against the system, the peasant revolts that happened. In addition to that, you have histories of migration, of women being trafficked. So they're like all borders. Even an open border is a border that is open to being. The act of crossing sometimes makes many acts criminalized. So I think that's one of those things. The second thing about Nepal is that I felt, again, how little as Indians, I'm talking about myself. There might be people who know far more about it. Even when I started researching the book, it became very clear that my understanding of Nepal was again dictated by a very specific Indian nationalistic gaze. But the point is that those in Nepal have a very complicated relationship with India for many, many reasons. It's not, again, of course, it's not the Punjab border, it's not the Bengal border, but the relationships are not as plain and clear as one perceives. Even the ones in which we feel like we have friendly relationships with, the local histories are far more complicated. These are histories where you bring in acts, these are also places that have had long histories of influence of peasant movements, their histories. Again, as I said, there is no one place. And also, unlike the other borders with the Nepal border, I really didn't get to spend a lot of time. I actually ran out of money at that point in time to do this work. So I felt that in addition to the people not wanting to be a part of the book, whatever I had, I felt was not enough. I wasn't going to write for the sake of writing. That once I felt that the story itself could not be a part of the book, then I had to then step back. I couldn't do a commentary role, or I couldn't talk about something where I felt I was less equipped to think about it.
You were detained a couple of times.
Yes.
Yourself. I recall at least 2, or was it 3 times you got detained by border forces?
I think there was an actual, I was told that I was detained.
Yeah.
In other places, it was just, they would just hold you for hours and hours and hours. It's just, and then they will let you go. But you really didn't know what precarious position you are in, because,
they took away your notebook at one point. They took away your notes and things.
They didn't take it away. It was more like, we want you to leave this. That's the thing, right? In the sense that when you're in these spaces, the way bureaucratic power works is they will recruit you in your act of surrendering your rights, right? So they hold you on for like, say, 45 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, and it's getting dark, and you need to cross a certain border in order to get to a certain place, because you promised someone that you would meet them in a very specific time. And again, it's unsafe for the other person who's about to meet you. So finally, at an hour and 25 or an hour, 2 hours into it, the waiting, you say, you know what, fine, I'll give you my camera, I'll give you my things, I'll leave all of my stuff here, let me go and come back. Because that is a negotiation that you do, because you've already waited for 2 hours. So in that sense, once you come back, it does feel like one is, but then you're also doing this. The real detainment was when I was taking a photograph and I didn't realize I was on the other side. I was very quickly told that I was detained, and I was told that I had to wait.
Myanmar.
Yeah. And it was, I don't want to use the word surreal, because it then feels that you're doing great disservice to that moment. But yes, this, again, what I want to make sure is that in this book, I've tried to make this book not about me, because someone like me being detained is not the same as someone in the region who might get detained and might not come back alive. I think that's a huge, that's why someone like me, who is English speaking, who comes with a certain kind of privileges, the act of me being detained is very different than someone else who might not come with these powers, right? There's a certain kind of, I remember people would say that another interesting thing is also people would ask you very quickly, what is your religion? Because I dress in a way in which there are no physical markers. You can't look at me and say, this person is a Hindu, this person is a Muslim, a Christian. So there are no religious markers in my face, except that I look a certain way. I carry a very expensive camera, which already attributes a certain kind of privilege. So people would ask you things like, are you Hindu or Muslim? Are you Hindu or Christian? They would ask, are you Brahmin? So in that sense, once people place you as a female Hindu body, then who also speaks English, who's traveling with expensive equipment, you're automatically given certain privileges that might protect you as against, say, Asimbai, who's lived in the region, but by a sheer act of being a Muslim man, would face far more for the act than me. So I think those are very important things for us to be very specific about, because not all bodies receive the same kind of bureaucratic or militarized treatments. I remember the first time I was in Kashmir, I was there, I arrived the day before August 15th, and I was walking down towards the stadium. Entire streets were empty, but they thought I was an Indian tourist. So what was denied to Kashmiri bodies in the heart of Srinagar was very easy for me, because the local CRPF thought I was an Indian tourist and I was allowed far more mobility. So in that sense, I think you really have to be very specific about how various bodies travel and what happens to various bodies when they get detained.
No, it was very interesting. I thought it was very revelatory too, because with a clear understanding of your own privilege, etc. If journalists and researchers are being treated a certain way, it is obviously 100 times worse for people who do not have either the language or the resources in order to document their story and or call for help if circumstances demand that. So I found that interesting from that perspective too, that if you're just somebody who's very obviously just here to document stuff, if you can be detained, well, that says something about the nature of living in a space like that. I'd like to, do you have a section marked out that you'd like to read, or would maybe a couple of pages?
I actually wanted to start with the prologue, um, which I didn't realize when I first. The prologue, by the way, is almost it's 15 years old. So the prologue came first. I wrote this soon after my friend passed away, and then I also realized how this book was not just a function of this travel, but this book is a function of so many things that happened to me long before this book project started. So I'm reading from the prologue, which is it's called My Ishmael. He had nothing left of his home except an old map of his city. The maps no longer looked like the map he had memorized as a student. It looked like a tilted triangle, but he called it the broken half of a whole. His school, the local factory that produced jams and juices, had been turned into a camp. His city was remade, and his country didn't this country doesn't exist anymore. He was a refugee twice over, an exile once, and an orphan always. After he arrived in this country, he renamed himself Ishmael, after the son who was supposed to be sacrificed to God but lived. He did everything he could to begin anew, but he could never entirely cleanse himself of the violence he had encountered. The war never left him. The pain of having lost his family and his home clung to him. Time no longer made sense to him. It no longer anchored him. For him, it no longer moved. It simply stagnated. When I met Ishmael, he had a set of notebooks with collected news clippings from the war years. He called the collection his Museum of Forgotten Facts. Flipping through his many notebooks, you would learn about an internment camp that men went to voluntarily because they thought they would be safer there than on the streets filled with men in uniforms. You would come across the cellist who performed at funerals for free during the height of the siege when every street corner had a sniper position to attack civilians. And you'd encounter the journalist who now cleans toilets in Sarajevo, who kept 100 notebooks with names of the dead and of the men he saw killed during those 20 days of carnage. Then there was the woman who had been starved at the internment camp. She lived but lost the sense of taste, except the taste of the cold prison floors. Freedom, once stolen, crippled, and starved, never managed to recover. Ishmael had a simple question. Why did his home not exist anymore? Why was it unmade and erased? Looking for answers, he said he would become a modern day Ibn Battuta, traveling the contours of apartheid and occupation, the fractured lines that refused to become nations, and the ugly walls and fences that divided people. His lines did not match the lines that proclaimed nations sovereign, but he never left the city of his last refuge. He stayed, he waited, and he rotted a little every day.
Please try speaking. Yeah. You need to unmute yourself, Annie. You have muted yourself, Annie. Please unmute yourself.
I think sometimes it becomes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I can't unmute myself. I think that's one of the settings. Okay, that was a very nice reading. Thank you so much, Suchitra. There's one particular thing that really struck me from the Nagaland chapter. One of the things that somebody says is something about buffers, where I'll just quote this bit here. You're speaking to a local pastor here, and you ask him if India wants to keep this area, the Tiansang area, as a buffer place. And he says, look what happened to Tibet and Afghanistan. Buffer, quote unquote, merely means that we are merely pawns. We are not a working part of the country. It also means that we are dispensable. And then he talks about the children leaving for the mainland and not fitting in, and racism and things like that. I'd just like you to comment a little bit on this idea of a buffer, where where just because you're in or near the border, you are assumed to sort of a certain amount of neglect is assumed, and why that happens.
Right. What was very interesting for me is when you start working on Afghanistan, because this project started for me in Afghanistan-Pakistan border, long before the India border comes into play. And while I was living and doing this work in Afghanistan, the idea of a buffer kept coming up very often, right? Afghans will tell, and what is very powerful is that, and I've seen this with Afghans, I've seen this with Palestinians, even with Kashmiris, is that a community that has struggled with their land being taken away um, can speak to you eloquently about their history of oppression through an historical lens. So in Afghanistan, you will constantly hear people saying that an empire had been reduced to a buffer to make way for imperial ambitions. But not the way that we think of in terms of a buffer in the modern nation state. So the buffer also becomes a playground for impunity. A buffer becomes a playground for imposing your territorial ambitions without regard for the people. And this will something that you will think about, but it's not just Afghanistan. And often you would hear this, while they might not use the word buffer, communities that have kind of survived this, whether it's in Kurdistan, whether it is here, whether it is even in parts of Punjab when I was traveling, the idea that you exist only to be a pawn in the hands of a nation state, or nation states trying to assert a certain kind of sovereignty, it was there everywhere. And also sometimes these buffers, I realize this idea of being a pawn and not really belonging to the body politic happens in multiple other places as well. You would hear some very similar things with other communities, where the idea of a buffer is not only an act of neglect, it is also an act of replicating these patterns of colonial rule. It's patterns of these spaces being included for the function of a nation, but not really belonging. It's not just bureaucratic neglect, it's also the things that we can do in terms of legal impunity. If you look at how ASFA has been implemented, it's these border states. But then you realize that in places like Jharkhand and others, then you have ideas of Salvajudam or a paramilitary army being raised. So, but this is not in the heart, but this is not the border. Here, we're creating buffers in the heart of the nation politics as well. So then the question becomes that which populations then become buffer and which populations are considered the mainland? Who is the nation state built for? Who is this freedom for? So I think the concept of a buffer kind of feeds into those questions as well, not only in terms of a region, but in terms of what this region gets remade. That's why, Aruni Kashyap writes about this, Dolly Kikon has written about this. This is not a frontier. This is not a forgotten space. These are real spaces that have real people struggling to deal with real questions of what it means to be who they are. And I think that's why the buffer becomes this important space. But then even those who understand that they're treating as a buffer militate against that. And that's why you see these movements, the push to want more, the push to fight for those things. But I think even there's other concepts like ungoverned spaces, right? For example, in the Assam chapter, you see that there are entire villages where the state has just retreated. The last time somebody remembers the state even coming in is when there was a terrible flood, and then a politician comes for a photo opportunity. So I think we should also maybe perhaps, I don't think I've done this in the book, but I think that's another interesting thing to explore is what spaces are governed, what spaces are governed and what places has the state completely retreated. For example, if you now look at my Twitter timeline, I would actually believe that the state seems to have retreated from, the function of taking care of its people, right? So how do you then think about the buffer? How do you then think about the nation? How do you think about the heartland?
Are we doing questions from other people too? Should I ask more questions? Should we leave some time? for others. How are we doing for time-wise? I have a bunch of questions.
Yeah, I have requested Preeti.
Yeah, I think we should ask people to put in questions into chat box. I think one or two people have already done that.
Okay.
There was something from Gurdas a little early on.
Did Suchitra find some border communities split across the borders? I'm thinking about the Indo-Myanmar, where some tribes may be living on the both sides, still sharing families ties. Yeah.
Yes, you will find this across all borders. You will find in the Bengal border, any border that is populated, you'll find this in Kashmir. Um, of course, with Rajasthan and with Punjab, it's not only communities, but you've also cut off. India has a lot, the South Asia has a lot of nomadic communities that traveled, migrated across. So you have communities that have would seasonally migrate from the Rann of Kutch all the way up to what is Sindh in Pakistan. So those migratory patterns. So you've not only cut off communities that have similar affiliations, you've also cut out migratory patterns. For instance, in Kashmir, you will find communities coming on the edge of a rock in this side across the river to just, catch a glimpse of the other communities there. Of course, in Ladakh and Kargil, there are villages that have been occupied by Pakistan and then been returned and taken back by India. And often communities there are seen with great distrust. There's an act of surveillance where you don't trust who they are. Similarly, in all of these communities, what you really see is not only local communities that once were able to pass back and forth, but all kinds of things have been butchered: histories, communities, peoples, travel routes. So that's across all of the borders.
Nanjay raised his hand, so we can ask him to come
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm sitting in Shillong, listening to you at my family home. Um, I have two questions. One is for the moderator because I don't think perhaps I may have misunderstood what she said. And one is to you, Suchitra. So I'll start with a question to the author, which is language and the kinship and power of language often drives uh, commonalities of communities. And that is connected to the question to the moderator, who I think said, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there was, India has geography borders with other countries where you don't really have common connections, uh, except for Nepal. That's not true. You have it for Western India and Northwestern India. You have it for Eastern India, for Bengal, and certainly the Northeast. We have a 1400 kilometer with Myanmar, in which most people speak each other's languages across the border. And in fact, Nagamese, which is a combination of Assamese and various Naga dialects, is now spoken right up to Kachin land thanks to the insurgents who took that route to China in the 60s and 70s. So I couldn't quite, if you did say this, I would disagree with you. Because I think there is much more to it than these things. Take, for instance, what happened in Mizoram and Myanmar. Several hundred people, up to 1,500 people, have taken refuge in Myanmar, in Mizoram from Myanmar, including 3 journalists in Manipur. And the government of India said, you have to send these people back. And the Mizoram chief minister said, nothing doing. These are our kin. They are our brothers, and they will go certainly back to death. So we aren't sending them back. We are looking at this as a humanitarian crisis. And if the government of India regards itself as a democratic government, and we are a big democratic nation, then we should behave like one. That was amazing coming from a small state, the leader of a small state, to the prime minister of this rather large country. I think the border speaks stronger than the mainland. So I'll stop there.
I can just respond to the bit that was relevant to me. I had not said that we have nothing in common. What I had said is that along most of India's borders, we create an other. And I'll pick up on what you said about the language, Sanjay, because I think that is actually something that I write about quite a bit in my own memoir. The otherization of Urdu, for instance, is one of the projects that is underway. We did have a language in common, both Punjabi and Urdu, but there is such a strong attempt to cut off that commonality, to not teach people the script, not allow any visibility of it in India, and in a way allow that language to become the language of the other. And similarly in Pakistan, they're not taught the Hindi script at all, the Nagari script. The language is the same. And one of the big thing with cultural exchange is that we are organically bound on both East and West, with both Bangla and Hindi and Urdu. But there is such a strong attempt not to allow that cultural exchange by banning films, by not allowing books to be sent across borders. This is one of the attempts that is being made to otherize, to finish the otherization. Therefore, linguistic minorities are created. And that then becomes a problem. It's the same in the East, where in Assam, for example, the Bangla-speaking person is seen with suspicion, even though West Bengal is so close. There is nothing to indicate that you cannot be an Indian if you're Bangla speaking. But the conflation of Bangla with Bangladeshi, and therefore outsider, and therefore less mistrustful. So this was the context in which I was asking the question, the context of the minoritization of people along border lines, and therefore Nepal I asked, because at least there is not the religious minoritization along that border. And Suchitra can add what she wants to say there.
Mr. Sanjay, can I actually have my question one more time? I seem to have kind of lost the question in this conversation.
Yeah, I just asked him to unmute. Yeah.
It's basically the point that Annie was talking about to a degree is the power of language on the borders. Because, what you say about Urdu and all that, that's interesting. But it's also a fact now that since last November, this government of India, has made and actually is driving a campaign for peace and tranquility and better relations with Pakistan, believe it or not. So I suddenly have my friends who are journalists in Pakistan suddenly and people in India coming together, which they haven't done for years. This is extraordinary, which has happened in the last 6 months. So, these things are
I'll believe it when they start giving each other visas.
The question of language, I think, yes, I think language has, it's a powerful sense. It's powerful in the memory. It's powerful in terms of culture. Also, language plays out in many ways. So, for example, even when I was first traveling early on in the book, I write about how I didn't know how to have these conversations, especially with the bureaucracy. And often I was, as a young brown woman traveling in these regions, it was very hard to, often you would encounter these very hostile, you'll have these hostile encounters. And one of the moments when I got a break was when in the Bengal borderlands, when I was traveling, there were a group of these young recruits, some of them from Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. As someone who is born to a Tamil father and a Telugu speaking mother, it was language in that region, the fact that I could speak both Tamil and Telugu and have that quick banter between the both of them then opened up conversations. So there's not just the borderlands communities that are divided and language plays a huge role. It's the sense of what language can do. The fact that I was Tamil, I could speak Tamil, the fact that I could speak Telugu to these young recruits from these regions, I think language had a very powerful moment of at least opens up. Similarly, even in the Bengal borderlands, you would see people talk about literature, history, songs, music. here language also becomes hybrid. Language again is not static. Various communities, even with the same language, the dialect changes. Mr. Suj in the book talks about how, he spoke Sindhi, he spoke Punjabi. He says that then Punjabi did not belong, a language did not belong to a community, it belonged to a culture. So yes, language in some ways was a very powerful way to think about how people remembered, how people allowed you into their homes, also made what could be a hostile encounter into an intervention or an opening to have those conversations.
Yeah, can I just, I don't want to take up more time, but I do have a point, an experience I'd like to share. You know, when I was driving with a team from Guwahati, I drove to Yangon, I mean, some years ago with a film crew. And I'm sure since you talked about speaking Tamil to this group of soldiers or whatever, I'm sure you come across the Tamil Sabha in Moreh.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
if you go beyond Moreh, you come to this place called Namfa Long, which is just across from Moreh before Tamu. In Namfa Long, the entire market is dominated by Gorkhas. And I was listening to them speak to each other and realized they're speaking Nepali, Gorkha. So I said, how come Gorkha, on this side you have Tamils, this side you have Gorkhas. The Tamils came because of the Second World War and the retreat from Singapore, but also the campaign against Indians by Ne Win in 62 and the junta. But the Gurkhas were settled by the British because at one time the British actually had designed the entire Northeast as a crown colony, as a buffer. I don't agree with whoever told you about the buffer concept because many of the Nagas don't even believe that themselves, nor do the Mizos. But that being said, I was really interested. I wanted to share that with you and just get some response from that. Thank you.
I think Samrat has an interesting
question,
question. Samrat, do you want to ask yourself or should I just read it out? Samrat?
I couldn't find him. Samrat?
He asked about maritime,
Yeah, you
borders.
can read out the question, and there's a question from Sukhdev Singh Sohal also, Dr. Sohal.
No, this was slightly different. He's asking you about
Maritime borders.
Yeah, I'm trying to search for it. But
Did you look at maritime borders?
yeah.
There were parts of the maritime border that I did but didn't make the book. I dropped the maritime border. It was both an intellectual and a methodological thing. One, I felt that I needed more time to think about the maritime border. Second, I think, how would you talk about these maritime borders? What stories would you sell? How would you think about the frontier? And also, how do these various communities, of course, there is the Tamil Elam comes into play, but also how, another question of how, say, for example, Tamils and Elam kind of see each other. But there's other histories too. So with the maritime border, it started a little bit with the Sundarbans, but at that point in time, I think there is much to be thought about. And since I started the work, I think there's been some really fascinating work on the Indian Ocean borders, the frontiers that's happening. But I think we need, at least for me, I think I need to think about these borders maritime borders in a far more sophisticated way. With the maritime border, there's a richness to, these various histories of migration. There is much to learn. It's just that it felt that the project was becoming untenable for me, but also I felt that I needed a little bit of time, space, and distance to think about what a maritime border or the maritime frontier, where does the frontier stop? Who are the people, which communities then get connected? How do you map these various communities? What histories do we think about? So no, I think that is something now increasingly you have some phenomenal scholars who are coming up with it, coming up with some really great work on the Indian Ocean and the region, but I think there is much to be done. And I didn't do it because it was one, I felt both not ready, but also I think it's a very different way of thinking about it than the land borders.
think Professor Behel has a question as well.
Yeah.
Sarabjot?
And it says like that would like to admit that your book stands approved and censored by Indian state
No,
as
that
well.
is somebody else. But does Sarabjot want to come on and ask his question first? Then
Yeah.
we can go to that other one.
No, I just wanted to historically find out that is it only the countries that have come under imperialism and who have been colonized, which have been colonized, are the ones who suffer from this typical syndrome of these kind of mutations and divisions, and it doesn't happen to rest of the world, the developed world. So how do you see it historically? In that perspective, how do you see this whole process? Thank you.
I'm not a historian of empire or colonization, but empire making has always been border making. Empire begins with creation of frontiers. Empire begins with the foundational violence of carving spaces out. And again, I think the European state formation has a very specific trajectory, and the regions, communities, and spaces that were colonized have a very different way of thinking about it. What I would recommend is Professor Sharma's book on empire making and what empire making and frontier making really play out. Now, the communities that you really look at is that, for example, the idea of a border within the Indian context was not so much a border, but a frontier. When you talk to people, especially the Afghans that I spoke to who were 80 or 90, their racial memory was not of a racial memory of a border. What they have is a racial memory of a frontier region. They don't even think of the border between India. For them, the India as it exists doesn't exist the way it does. So what I would really say is that I think this is a far more complicated question. And yes, I think empire also has very different ways in which it plays out. But taking a geography and splitting it up, whether it's Palestine, whether it is the regions in Kurdistan, whether how Iraq was carved out. So what we're really seeing is the empire making project still playing out to this day. As I said, I'm not a historian of empire, but there are other brilliant works that actually talk about this.
Anila is here as well, Anila Zaib Babar, and she says, I've been using the Akhura-Agartala border quite frequently in the past year to get to Dhaka, and it's surreal to discover that there can be border crossings which are not a moment of occasion, as what I understand of Vaga, that there can be gentler ways to meander about too. Anyway, that was one of the things that I wanted to actually ask you as well. The significance of all these rituals that happen at borders. I mean, Vaga being a prime example since we are located in Amritsar as well. What do you make of that?
One of the things that I wouldn't want to do was see the change of guard, the Wagah border, because it had become so militarized. It had become a function we were performing, and somehow it had become the Colosseum, right? It felt like the modern day Colosseum, and then we were the audience. And I think a lot of people have written about it, but I think there is something more that we really need to tease out in terms of these performance of what a border is. For someone like me, the first time I encounter an idea of a border is when you're 10 years old. I think I'm about 10 years old, and Mani Ratnam's Roja comes out. It's a breakout film. It's interesting because the music, A.R. Rahman's first film. But as a cultural and historical moment, the first time someone like me in the south of India in Madras encounters a border is through this very visually aesthetized way of presenting Kashmir. And often I think the way we encounter a border also then feeds into how we think one should exist in a border, how we should perform in a border. Yes, some crossings are more benign, some crossings are more gentler, if that's still the word one uses, but the act of crossing is also an act of privilege, and how one gets to cross is an act of privilege. Not everybody gets to cross in certain ways. I think that's an important part of it. Second is someone like me, I think that's another thing, that going back to the idea of who's the body that it travels, right? I think the body that travels is a very important question. Also, that affects the ways in which these crossings are affected. I have always had a passport. I've always been a citizen of a state. At least I've always been a citizen of what was perhaps once a democratic state, which also gives me certain ways in which I could travel. I had ID cards. I look a certain way. I speak a certain way. So my meanderings are possible for me, but meanderings might not be possible for everyone. Brown and black bodies are called immigrants, refugees, but white bodies are called wanderlust. They're called travelers. They're called nomads. So I think that's also very important, not just how borders play out, but who is crossing and when what body crosses. And I think that's also important for us to keep in mind. Because in the book, there is this other young woman who crosses for the act of getting marriage, and the act of crossing then renders her undocumented, renders her, the rhetoric of illegal body. But I'm also a brown body, and when I cross for the act of marriage, I don't become undocumented, right? So I think that is also very important in terms of not just different borders, but how these borders treat different bodies. And I think that is really important.
There was a really interesting question from someone about the books. You had started to recommend a book, and he'd asked about your research and whether there were other books that you'd like to recommend that inspired you to or informed your research.
To prepare for this book, as I said, I write to make sense of my social world. So when I started researching the book, I had think about close to 130 books to her. I think at the end of it, about 142 books that I had. But so some of it was history, some of it was writing. But when I really came down to write the book, so I divided the books that I had in two spaces. One was books that taught me history, that gave me context. Another was I was learning to write in a certain way that wasn't heavy. I didn't go to a writing school. I've always wanted to be a writer, but it took me till I was 28, 29 to even with confidence say, fine, I want to write. I had written as a lawyer, I had written as a researcher, which are very completely different acts of writing than writing for a community, for your people. So the second set of books that I really wanted to read was, I went back and found authors who I wanted to emulate. What about their books really spoke to me? In that context, I think I read actually Annie's book was one of those books that I went back to very often, because to write in a way that is simple, because you're telling incredibly painful stories, you're telling histories that are already with gravity. So I read, of course, I read a lot of Annie's book. I read another person that I really thought that I read Daniel Valentine's Charred Lullabies, which looked at the work in Sri Lanka. Other works that I really liked was to write with anger and compassion. I didn't want to take that anger away from the book. So a lot of Audre Lorde, Iqbal Ahmed. So I can put out, that's a long list of people. Another book that I also went back to was Anton Chekhov's book in terms of just writing, because, the sense and the smell and how do you write in it. So in that sense, I did both. I did both historical research, anthropological work that I liked, but also kind of going back to writers whose works that I thought really spoke to me. I read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of poetry by Lebanese, Iranian, and Turkish artists. So the books were long, it was meandering, but the hardest thing was to find a language. And that really helped, just going back to the writers whose works that I loved, because that's how, as at least for me, as humans, you try to emulate, you try to learn the best. So whatever I wrote, I thought I took from those whose works that I truly loved and wanted to emulate. And that's how I put this together.
Somebody wanted to ask you if your book had been censored, and also whether you're doing a sequel.
No, we were very worried that the book would be censored, in the sense that, I mean, anything now can be censored. We have people being arrested for a tweet. So I wrote this book, and I wrote this book knowing that I would be completely responsible for the consequences. But at the same time, I'm a first-time writer. I don't come from a literary pedigree. It took me over 10 years to think about this project, conceive it, write it, and get this book published, which meant that I wanted people to read this book, but without mincing words. And that was really hard to do. So one thing that I did do was, of course, I took away stories from the book that people no longer wanted in it. I tried to keep them and protect the names of people in the book. A lot of the times when we felt that somebody could be in danger, either things, identifying details were kind of removed to make it a little bit more vague. There are acknowledgements. I censored myself in terms of acknowledgements. I didn't know it was safe to put some names, people who were very much so in that sense, yes, the censorship happens in different ways. I do not know what to call it, but I was very careful to protect the people in the book. The book has been out in India for 2 months now. I don't think anyone is censored it. The book is traveling, but one never knows. So I'm responsible for a book. So you write a book and you let it out. So no, it hasn't been censored in that sense, but one did take a lot of precaution in terms of making sure that the people in the book are protected, that there was consent in terms of telling their stories and the way that they wanted to be represented.
But there's a question also about unification of royal states of India and whether that was an act of violence. I'm not sure if that's not really about your book, but I mean, if you want to answer that.
I'm not a historian of. I have read Ashoka Mitran's book on what happened to Secunderabad. There is fiction. There's non-fiction writing on how Hyderabad was violently integrated, but I don't know. I'm not a historian of how the royal states were reunified. So yeah, that's first part. I don't know if there will be a sequel to the book. I don't know. It took me a very long time to be in a place to do the kind of thing that I want to do. I literally had to create a universe for me to do the kind of work that I did, which was bringing together writing, thinking, research, and also using my skills as a lawyer and a researcher, ways for me to use text and images. So I literally had to create a universe in which I could do this work, and that's not easy. So when one has struggled, so when that's taken time to do that, I think my job is to respond to a very specific political and social moment. When I started writing this book, I was responding to what I thought was a very specific moment. So what I will write next would be responding to this very moment. I do not know if that will become a sequel. But I don't have to be the only person who writes about borders. There's so many interesting stories that are being told by different people. But if there is a sequel, perhaps I would think about the Maritime Frontiers as one of the things. But again, I think that's a few years, at least in the making, in terms of even just thinking.
How are we doing for time? Are we out of time?
I think we should wrap up. There's one last question. I don't know if you want to take that from Raman, which is in the chat box. Maybe this is the last, and then we ask Gur Pratap to please wrap up after that. This is: how do you evaluate the degree of communalization in India's borderlands in comparison to that in the mainland? Are there changes after 2014?
I started traveling in India in 2013, and the last of my travels happened around 2018 and 19. And even in that period of time, I could see things change. When I first started traveling, I didn't feel unsafe. I never felt unsafe. Towards the end of the travels, I really did. By 2018, 19, it felt more unsafe for me. Something about it had changed. I couldn't put something on it. I think the communalization process was playing out as I was. But again, I think that I don't know. I feel like sometimes the words that we use don't completely encompass or explain the social worlds that we live in. So I don't think it's just communalization. And I think in a place like India, as I said, history and memory is so local. It's not just communalization, it's a function of caste, class, access to land, who has access to land, even within communalization, which communities then bear the brunt of violence while others can perhaps escape. And I think it's a far more complex, complicated process. But one thing in reality is that there are things that I heard post 2014-15 in living rooms, which I hadn't heard before. There were things, for example, when I first started traveling, people would ask, the question would be, there would be very meandering ways of asking or trying to place you in a very specific caste, religious, hierarchical location. Towards the end of the travel, it became very specific. The questions then became, are you a Muslim? Are you this? Are you that? So language also changed in those ways. So I think, yes, there is a process in which there is fragmentations of identities. And I think there is a deep sense of creating others out of everyone. But I think the process is far more complicated. It's not just communalization, it's something else. And we really have to take into each geography has a very specific sense of history and memory. And we have to think about, as I said, caste, class, access to land, histories of violence, who becomes targeted by violence, what are the local dynamics. But there is a process of defragmentation. There is a process that is now trying to reduce people. M. Rajshekhar's book, Despite the State, actually talks about this from a political economy point of view, where you can't just be an Adarsh member of a caste, you have to be an Adarsh member of a subcaste, sub-community. If you are a certain community, then you can't even rent your house to someone else. So in that sense, I think, yes, there is a fragmentation, but I think we need to be a little bit more specific about how we think and write about these processes.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And because Macha House is located in Amritsar and we are all borderlanders in a manner, it's always really interesting to hear these conversations. It seemed to impact daily life also of a lot of people that you meet there. But thank you. I'm going to ask Gurpratap to please do our formal closing from the Macha House team.
Thanks, Preeti. And I would like to thank you, Suchitra and Annie, for this wonderful, wonderful session. When we think of history, we see it as a cut and dried subject without anything of interest to anyone. But the way that you have presented your views and your stories and the common man's stories was very interesting, very informative, and also very revealing. The stories you have shared with us made us feel absolutely connected. It isn't something distant and removed from us, but something immediate, relevant, very identifiable, and deeply moving. I'm reminded of a quote, we may be done with the past, but the past is not done with us. And today, that is exactly what we all feel, that there is something in the past that reaches out to us every now and then. And it is then that we feel the strong connect. We find ourselves tied with the past to others like us. Thank you once again, Suchitra, for this wonderful conversation. And thank you, Annie, for your very insightful and incisive questions. Since we were also talking about history and borders, I'm also reminded of a very brief nazm by Gulzar Saab. लकीरें हैं तो रहने दो, लकीरें हैं तो रहने दो, किसी ने गुस्से में आकर रूठ कर खींच दी थी शायद. लकीरें हैं तो रहने दो, किसी ने रूठ कर गुस्से में आकर खींच दी थी शायद. इनको अब बनाओ पाला और आओ कबड्डी खेलते हैं. लकीरें हैं तो रहने दो. बॉर्डर्स का जिक्र हो रहा है तो मैं आगे के प्रोग्राम्स का भी जिक्र करना चाहूंगा, क्योंकि हमारा जो अगला प्रोग्राम है विच इज ऑन द नेक्स्ट वीकेंड, दैट इज अगेन अबाउट बॉर्डर्स एंड हाउ पोरस दैन कैन बी एंड हाउ पीपल मैनेज टू स्लिप थ्रू दोज बॉर्डर्स एंड बिकम फ्यूजिटिव्स. मैं जैसे बॉर्डर्स की बात करता हूँ तो फ्यूजिटिव्स की बात होती है तो काफी सारे हमारे जो फ्यूजिटिव्स होते हैं वो यूके जाके छुप जाते बिकॉज दे हैव अ वेरी स्ट्रॉन्ग पॉलिसी. and they are in the process of being brought back. एक case का तो आज ही report आई थी. I won't be talking about that. But do join us for a wonderful, thrilling session, Escaped, True Stories of Indian Fugitives in London, which is a conversation with authors Danish Khan and Ruhi Khan about their notebook, which tracks 12 cases involving some high-profile alleged offenders wanted in India who are now in the UK. They will be in conversation with Pooja Changoiwal. And the last session for April, it is going to be a grand session because it is about the last queen, the story of Rani Jinda. And it will be a conversation between Chitra Banerjee and Mandira Nair. So do join us for two wonderful and promising sessions. And on behalf of Maja House, I thank both of you, Suchitra and Annie, and all our friends who joined us today and stayed with us. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank you, Suchitra. Thank you, Annie. God bless.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Good night.